June 6, 1944, the morning fog lifted over Normandy's blood-soaked beaches, and Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann peered through his machine gun sights at something that would shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht had cultivated about their new enemy. Wave after wave of American soldiers poured from landing craft, and what struck Zimmermann most was not their numbers, though those were staggering, but their youth, their equipment, and their seemingly reckless determination. He had been told Americans were soft, undisciplined civilians in uniform who would crumble under the first artillery barrage. The reality unfolding before him told a drastically different story. The German High Command had spent months constructing an image of American forces that now seemed dangerously divorced from reality. Through the smoke and chaos of that longest day, German defenders witnessed something unexpected. Americans who kept coming despite horrific casualties, soldiers who coordinated with a level of technological sophistication the Wehrmacht could only envy, and men who fought with a peculiar combination of apparent casualness and deadly effectiveness. Zimmermann would later write in his diary that the Americans attacked like tourists who happened to bring overwhelming firepower on vacation. In the fortified positions along the Atlantic Wall, veteran German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front found themselves confronting an entirely different kind of warfare. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, a decorated veteran of Stalingrad, watched American forces advance with tanks, artillery, and air support working in seamless coordination. The Americans seemed to wage war as if it were an industrial process, something that could be systematized, optimized, and mass-produced like the Ford automobiles German officers had once admired. According to records maintained by the German Seventh Army, this realization spread quickly through the ranks. They were not facing poorly trained conscripts, but rather the mechanized arm of the world's greatest industrial power. The contrast between German expectations and American reality created a psychological shock that rippled through Wehrmacht ranks. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had spent years portraying Americans as jazz-playing, gangster-influenced weaklings who lacked the martial spirit of German warriors. Yet here they were, these supposed weaklings, supported by firepower that seemed limitless. A captured German officer's interrogation report from late June 1944, preserved in U.S. Army archives, revealed the cognitive dissonance. We were told they could not fight. We were told they had no stomach for sacrifice. We watched them die by the thousands on the beaches, and still they came. What kind of soft men do this? As night fell on that historic day, surviving German defenders began processing what they had witnessed. The Americans had not fought like the British, with their measured advances and rigid tactical formations. They had not fought like the Russians, with waves of expendable infantry. They fought like Americans, with an improvisational creativity backed by staggering material superiority. Young German conscripts, many experiencing combat for the first time, whispered to one another in their bunkers. The conversation had shifted from whether they would defeat the Americans to how they might survive them. The illusions carefully constructed by years of propaganda had been demolished in a single day, replaced by a more complicated and considerably more frightening truth. August 15, 1944, outside the Norman town of Falaise, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood amid the wreckage of his panzer battalion and confronted an undeniable reality that Wehrmacht training had never prepared him for. The American military machine did not simply fight. It consumed everything in its path with industrial efficiency. Weber had commanded tanks across the steppes of Russia, had outmaneuvered British forces in North Africa, but nothing in his experience compared to the systematic destruction American forces brought to bear. His battalion had been reduced to scrap metal not through superior German tactical prowess being overcome, but through the simple application of overwhelming material advantage. The German military had always prided itself on tactical sophistication, on the ability of skilled commanders to outthink and outmaneuver numerically superior forces. This doctrine, proven effective against Poland-France, and initially against the Soviet Union, encountered its nemesis in American operational methods. Where German forces emphasized the brilliance of individual commanders, Americans systematized warfare itself. Every German officer who survived an engagement with American forces remarked on the same phenomenon. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of everything. Artillery shells fell like rain, Tanks appeared in numbers that defied belief, and air support arrived with such regularity one could set a watch by it. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr Division during the Normandy campaign, provided perhaps the most vivid description of American material superiority in his post-war testimony. The Americans attacked with methods that transformed warfare from an art into mass production, he stated in interviews conducted by U.S. Army historians in 1946. They did not send their best tanks against our Panthers and Tigers. They sent 5 Shermans for every one of our tanks, and when we destroyed 3, the remaining 2 destroyed us. Then 5 more Shermans would arrive. This testimony, documented in the official U.S. Army history, Normandy to the Elbe, captured the frustration of German commanders trained to believe that skill and determination could overcome material disadvantage. The psychological impact of this material disparity cannot be overstated. German soldiers, even those who maintained faith in ultimate victory, began to understand they were fighting against an enemy who could afford to waste resources in ways that seemed almost obscene. American trucks, jeeps, and equipment appeared in such abundance that would sometimes abandon vehicles rather than perform minor repairs. German troops, accustomed to fighting with carefully rationed supplies and equipment maintained until it literally fell apart, found this profligacy both shocking and demoralizing. August Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his memoirs that his men would risk their lives to capture American supply depots, not for strategic advantage but simply to experience briefly the feeling of having more equipment than they could possibly use. Yet German observations went beyond mere material calculations. Wehrmacht officers noted that American soldiers fought differently depending on their leadership, unit cohesion, and experience level. Green American divisions would sometimes panic under artillery fire or fail to exploit tactical advantages. Veteran American units, however, demonstrated a flexibility and initiative that contradicted German assumptions about American military culture. The U.S. Army's practice of promoting capable soldiers regardless of social class or formal education struck German officers, many from aristocratic or upper-middle-class backgrounds, as both democratic chaos and disturbingly effective. By late summer 1944, honest assessments circulating among German field commanders painted a picture far removed from propaganda's confident predictions. The Americans were learning, adapting, and bringing their enormous industrial capacity to bear with increasing effectiveness. They made mistakes, certainly, but they could afford mistakes in ways the Wehrmacht could not. Each American division destroyed or bloodied in battle would be replaced by 2 fresh divisions equipped with the latest weapons. Each German division destroyed represented irreplaceable combat power. The mathematics of attrition, German officers realized with growing dread, led inexorably to only one conclusion. October 23, 1944, in a farmhouse near Aachen that had become a temporary prisoner of war collection point, Lieutenant Ernst Vogel sat across a wooden table from his American captors and experienced a form of cognitive dissonance that would haunt him for decades. His guards were chewing gum, an act that seemed almost obscenely casual in the midst of war. They offered him cigarettes, real American cigarettes whose quality made German rations taste like burning paper. They asked him questions about his hometown, his family, his opinions on the war, as if they were neighbors meeting at a local cafe rather than enemies on a battlefield. This casualness, this apparent lack of hatred, confused Vogel more than the combat itself had. German soldiers, raised on notions of martial discipline and military hierarchy, struggled to comprehend the informality of American military culture. Wehrmacht training emphasized rigid obedience, clear hierarchical structures, and the suppression of individual personality in favor of unit cohesion. American soldiers, by contrast, seemed to maintain their civilian identities even in uniform. They called their officers by rank rather than with the elaborate deference German military protocol demanded. They complained openly about orders, conditions, and leadership in ways that would have resulted in severe punishment within the Wehrmacht. Yet somehow, this apparent indiscipline did not prevent them from fighting effectively when circumstances demanded. The class dynamics within the American military particularly puzzled German observers. A captured German intelligence report from December 1944, analyzing American military effectiveness, noted with bewilderment that American officers often came from middle-class or even working-class backgrounds. The report's author seemed unable to comprehend how men without proper breeding could effectively command troops. Yet these officers of common origin led their men with a pragmatic efficiency that aristocratic German officers, for all their theoretical military education, found difficult to match. The American military appeared to promote based on capability rather than birth, a concept that struck many Wehrmacht officers as both revolutionary and potentially threatening to good order. German soldiers also remarked repeatedly on American attitudes toward death and sacrifice. While Wehrmacht ideology glorified death in service to the fatherland, American soldiers seemed to view death as something to be avoided through superior firepower and tactical caution rather than embraced through heroic sacrifice. "They fight to live, not to die," wrote Jeff writer Anton Becker in letters home that were later intercepted by Allied intelligence. "They seem to believe that throwing away your life is stupid rather than noble. Yet they still attack, still advance, still accept terrible casualties when their officers order it. I cannot understand them." This observation captured a fundamental philosophical difference. Germans had been taught that willingness to die proved martial virtue, while Americans seemed to believe that staying alive while completing the mission represented greater military skill. Perhaps nothing illustrated the cultural gulf more vividly than German reactions to American racial dynamics. Wehrmacht soldiers, indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, expected American Negro troops to be inferior soldiers. The reality proved more complicated and more damaging to German racial theories than propaganda had prepared them for. When the all-black 92nd Infantry Division and integrated units fought effectively, German prisoners expressed confusion. Some rationalized that black American soldiers fought well because they had been Germanized through military training. Others simply refused to discuss the topic, perhaps sensing that acknowledging black Americans as effective soldiers would undermine the entire racial edifice Nazi ideology had constructed. The American relationship with material comfort also struck German observers as distinctly foreign. Americans seemed to believe that soldiers deserved good food, medical care, and creature comforts even in combat zones. German military culture, by contrast, emphasized hardship as character building and complaint as weakness. When German prisoners experienced American POW camps, with their relatively generous rations and medical care, many initially suspected a propaganda trick. The cognitive dissonance of receiving better treatment as prisoners than they had received as combat soldiers in their own army created psychological conflicts that some former Wehrmacht soldiers struggled to resolve even decades later. The Americans, it seemed, waged war without truly hating their enemies, a concept that German military culture found almost incomprehensible. January 17, 1945, the frozen forests of the Ardennes still bore the scars of Germany's desperate gamble, and Oberstleutnant Joseph Dietrich found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about American fighting spirit. The Battle of the Bulge had been conceived as a lightning strike against supposedly weak American lines, a replay of 1940's triumph against France. Instead, the Wehrmacht had crashed against American defenders who refused to break even when surrounded, who held critical road junctions despite overwhelming odds, and who counterattacked with a speed that left German commanders scrambling to respond. The Americans, it turned out, could be surprised but not defeated, disorganized but not destroyed. The defense of Bastogne became, for many German soldiers, the moment when respect for American forces crystallized into something approaching admiration. Surrounded American paratroopers, outnumbered and outgunned, had responded to surrender demands with what became a famous one-word reply. Nuts, this response. So casual and so American, somehow encapsulated everything that made U.S. forces dangerous. They did not surrender when military logic suggested they should. They maintained humor and morale in circumstances that would have broken less cohesive units. And when relief arrived, they transitioned immediately from desperate defense to aggressive counterattack. General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, whose forces had demanded Bastogne's surrender, later admitted that American determination there had exceeded anything Wehrmacht intelligence had predicted. Veterans of the Eastern Front, transferred west to face the American onslaught, provided particularly valuable perspectives on comparative fighting quality. These were men who had survived the meat grinder of the Russian campaign, who had experienced combat at its most brutal and absolute. Their assessments carried weight that propaganda could not easily dismiss. The Russians would attack with waves of men, accepting casualties that numbed the mind, recalled Hauptmann Wilhelm Hoffmann in post-war interviews. The Americans attacked with waves of artillery, aircraft, and tanks, accepting casualties only when absolutely necessary. Both were terrifying in different ways. The Russians made you fear being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Americans made you fear being erased by industrial efficiency. German military culture had long emphasized individual heroism and tactical brilliance as the keys to victory. American forces seemed to operate on different principles entirely. Small unit actions revealed American soldiers capable of remarkable initiative and flexibility, characteristics Wehrmacht doctrine associated with specially trained elite units rather than average infantry. When command and control broke down, American units often continued fighting effectively, with junior officers and even enlisted men stepping up to lead. This decentralized approach, which gave individual soldiers more autonomy than German military culture typically allowed, proved devastatingly effective in the fluid combat of France and Germany. The quality of American non-commissioned officers particularly impressed German observers who survived close combat. Wehrmacht doctrine concentrated decision, making authority in officers with NCOs serving primarily as enforcers of discipline and orders. American NCOs, by contrast, often served as tactical leaders and combat problem solvers, bridging the gap between officer intent and battlefield reality. A confidential Wehrmacht assessment from February 1945 noted that American sergeants display initiative and tactical competence that our doctrine reserves for lieutenants and captains. This distributes leadership throughout their formations in ways that make them resilient to casualties and disruption. By early 1945, even the most fanatical Nazi true believers within the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain propaganda's narrative of American military inferiority. In soldiers' letters, in conversations between prisoners, in confidential reports between commanders, a consensus emerged. The Americans were formidable opponents who combined material superiority with genuine fighting ability. They were not supermen, and they could be defeated in individual engagements, but they learned from mistakes, adapted tactics quickly, and brought resources to bear that made ultimate victory against them impossible. Respect for American forces did not translate into defeatism, not yet, but it did create a realistic assessment that stood in stark contrast to the fantasies German propaganda continued to broadcast. The Americans, German soldiers now understood, had proven themselves in the crucible of combat. Whatever their perceived cultural flaws, they were warriors who deserved to be taken seriously. March 30th, 1945. Jeff writer Hans Schmidt watched American troops enter his village in the Rhineland and experienced emotions he had not expected: relief, shame, and bitter vindication all mixed together. The Americans came not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as something more complex. They were combat soldiers, certainly with weapons ready and faces hard from months of fighting. But they were also young men who offered chocolate to children, who seemed genuinely surprised by the level of destruction they encountered, and who treated surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers with a casualness that bordered on indifference rather than hatred. Schmidt, who had been conscripted in 1943 at age 17, had believed Nazi propaganda promising that defeat would mean annihilation. The reality proved far different from those predictions. As American forces penetrated deeper into Germany proper, Wehrmacht soldiers and German civilians alike confronted the disconnect between what they had been promised and what they experienced. Goebbels had warned that American occupation would bring horror, that Jewish soldiers would exact terrible revenge, that Negro troops would run amok. Instead, most Germans encountered American soldiers who seemed primarily interested in finding comfortable billets, acquiring souvenirs, and getting home as quickly as possible. The contrast between promised apocalypse and banal reality created cognitive dissonance that forced many Germans to question what else their government had lied about. The discovery of concentration camps by advancing American forces added another layer of complexity to German perceptions. Many Wehrmacht soldiers claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's full extent, and some genuinely had been sheltered from knowledge of the regime's worst crimes. When American forces began compelling German civilians and captured soldiers to witness concentration camp horrors, reactions varied from shock to denial to sullen acceptance. Some German soldiers, confronted with evidence of atrocities committed in their nation's name, attempted to distance themselves from Nazi ideology they had previously supported. Others retreated into denial or rationalization. The Americans' anger at these discoveries was palpable, and for the first time, many German soldiers understood that they had been fighting not just for military objectives, but in service of genuine evil. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives, American treatment of German prisoners improved dramatically as the war progressed and victory became certain. Early in the campaign, when casualties were high and combat intensity extreme, POW treatment could be rough. By spring 1945, with Germany's defeat inevitable, American forces processed prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency rather than vengeance. This pragmatic approach confused Germans who had been taught that military defeat meant national destruction. Instead, they found themselves in POW camps with adequate food, medical care, and treatment that, while certainly not pleasant, adhered broadly to Geneva Convention standards. Former SS members faced harsher treatment, but ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers often remarked that imprisonment by Americans was far preferable to the Eastern Front's alternatives. The American practice of denazification, implemented even before Germany's formal surrender, revealed another aspect of American military culture that Germans struggled to understand. Americans seemed to believe that Nazism was something separate from German national character, an ideology that could be extracted like a rotten tooth. Wehrmacht soldiers undergoing denazification lectures found themselves treated as people who had been misled rather than as inherently evil. This approach, paternalistic and often tone-deaf to German sensibilities, nonetheless suggested that Americans distinguished between the Nazi regime and the German people in ways that simplified both but also offered paths toward eventual reconciliation. Individual encounters between German soldiers and their American captors often contradicted years of propaganda. Lieutenant Peter Wolf, captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, later described conversations with his guards that shattered assumptions on both sides. The Americans were curious about German military tactics, asked questions about Hitler's appeal, and seemed genuinely interested in Germany's path to catastrophe. They were not the mindless, jazz-corrupted degenerates Nazi propaganda had described. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, and college students from California who had been drafted into a war they wanted to finish so they could return to lives they actually enjoyed. Their lack of ideological fervor, once perceived by Wehrmacht soldiers as weakness, now appeared as a kind of strength. They fought effectively without needing to hate, killed efficiently without losing their humanity, and won decisively while planning magnanimously for peace. April 25, 1945, along the banks of the Elbe River near Torgau, advance elements of the American 69th Infantry Division made contact with Soviet forces, and the remaining Wehrmacht units trapped between these converging armies faced a choice that crystallized their accumulated experiences of fighting both adversaries. Every German soldier knew the accounts from the Eastern Front, understood what Soviet captivity typically meant. Faced with encirclement, thousands of Wehrmacht troops fought desperately westward, seeking to surrender to Americans rather than Russians. This mass migration toward American lines represented the final, clearest verdict on how German soldiers had come to view their Western enemies. As soldiers they respected, as captors they could survive, as representatives of a civilization that, for all its perceived flaws, offered hope rather than annihilation. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of defeated Germans was not subtle, and Wehrmacht soldiers exploited it whenever possible. Entire divisions, some still combat-effective and well-armed, negotiated surrenders to American forces rather than fight to the death as Hitler's increasingly desperate orders demanded. Oberst Gerhard Wilk, commanding the Aachen garrison in October 1944, had fought Americans house to house until his position became untenable, then surrendered with the expectation of survival. By April 1945, this calculation had become standard throughout Wehrmacht ranks. Americans took prisoners, processed them through established systems, and generally adhered to international law. Fighting them meant risking death in combat but not guaranteed torture and execution if captured. The final weeks of the war revealed how thoroughly German military assessments of American forces had evolved. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, signing Germany's unconditional surrender documents on May 7, 1945 in Reims, did so before American and Allied officers who embodied everything Wehrmacht doctrine had once dismissed. They were professional without being militaristic, victorious without being vengeful, and powerful without being cruel. The ceremony itself, conducted with military precision but without triumphalism, demonstrated American attitudes toward defeated enemies. Germans were expected to acknowledge defeat clearly and completely, but they were not subjected to deliberate humiliation. This restraint, particularly when compared to how Nazi Germany had treated conquered peoples, created complex emotions among surviving Wehrmacht officers. Post-war interrogations of senior German commanders revealed sophisticated and generally accurate assessments of American military capabilities. Generalfield Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when debriefed by U.S. Army historians, provided detailed analysis of American tactical evolution from Normandy to the Rhine. He acknowledged that German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood American military potential, mistaking a civilian army's initial combat awkwardness for permanent incompetence. They learned faster than we anticipated, von Rundstedt admitted, and they brought resources to bear that made learning from mistakes a sustainable strategy. We could not afford their losses. They could not be stopped by ours. The mythology that developed in post-war Germany regarding American forces often sanitized the relationship in ways that served both German and American Cold War interests. Wehrmacht veterans emphasized their respect for American fighting ability while downplaying ideological complicity with Nazism. American military historians highlighted Wehrmacht tactical sophistication while minimizing the degree to which ordinary German soldiers had supported Hitler's regime. This mutual reconstruction of the past created narratives of clean Wehrmacht fighting honorably against worthy opponents, narratives that subsequent historical research has complicated considerably. The reality was messier. German soldiers had committed atrocities and fought for an evil cause, while American soldiers had engaged in their own war crimes on a smaller scale and fought imperfectly for a just cause. Yet beneath the post-war myth-making lay genuine German military respect for American forces, hard-earned through years of combat. This respect was not affection, not friendship, but professional acknowledgement between warriors who had tested each other under the worst possible circumstances. German veterans, when speaking honestly rather than performing for post-war audiences, acknowledged that American forces had been underestimated catastrophically. They combined material superiority with genuine tactical competence, technological innovation with human courage, industrial efficiency with individual initiative. They were not the soft, decadent civilians Nazi propaganda had described. They were the armed forces of a continental industrial democracy that, once roused to war, proved almost impossible to defeat. For surviving Wehrmacht soldiers, this realization represented both a military lesson and a broader philosophical reckoning with everything they had believed about democratic societies, industrial warfare, and the sources of national power. September 2, 1989, at a veterans reunion in Virginia, aged former Wehrmacht soldiers sat across tables from the American GIs they had once fought, and conversations revealed how decades had transformed wartime enemies into something approaching friends. These meetings, increasingly common as Cold War tensions eased and both sides aged into their twilight years, created spaces for honest reflection that propaganda and immediate post-war politics had not permitted. What emerged from these conversations was nuanced. German veterans acknowledged that American forces had been far more formidable than Nazi ideology had prepared them to face, while American veterans admitted that fighting the Wehrmacht had been harder and more costly than their own propaganda had suggested. Both sides, survivors of history's most destructive conflict, recognized that they had been pawns in a larger ideological struggle, though one side had fought for democracy and the other for fascism. The German military's post-war assessment of American combat effectiveness, documented in confidential studies prepared for NATO purposes during the 1950s, revealed a fundamental reassessment of what made armies effective. Wehrmacht doctrine had emphasized tactical brilliance, operational art, and the fighting spirit of individual soldiers. American forces had proven that systematic logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to learn and adapt could overcome traditional military virtues. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's new armed force, incorporated lessons from both Wehrmacht tactical sophistication and American organizational methods, creating a hybrid doctrine that acknowledged both traditions' strengths. Academic historians, given access to German military archives in subsequent decades, discovered that German assessments of American forces had been remarkably candid in confidential internal documents, even as public propaganda maintained fictions of American weakness. A Wehrmacht intelligence summary from July 1944, classified at the time and only declassified in the 1970s, stated bluntly, "The American soldier, when properly led and supplied, demonstrates combat effectiveness equal to German formations. Their material superiority in armor, artillery, and air support makes them collectively more dangerous than any opponent we have previously faced, including Soviet forces." This assessment, never intended for public consumption, contradicted everything Nazi propaganda claimed about American military inferiority. The question of whether German soldiers' wartime assessments of Americans were colored by their service to an evil regime remained contested among historians. Some scholars argued that Wehrmacht soldiers' professional respect for American forces represented a form of moral evasion, acknowledging American military competence while avoiding responsibility for Nazi crimes. Others contended that battlefield assessments could be separated from ideological questions, that soldiers could evaluate enemy effectiveness independent of larger moral judgments. The truth likely encompassed both positions. German soldiers could simultaneously respect American fighting ability while supporting or tolerating a regime that committed genocide. Military professionalism and moral complicity were not mutually exclusive. The Cold War created strange alliances that complicated German memories of American forces. Former Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought Americans during World War II found themselves allied with the United States against the Soviet Union, facing eastward once again, but this time alongside their former enemies. This geopolitical transformation required psychological gymnastics. The Americans who had been enemies became protectors, while the Soviets who had been allies became the primary threat. For German veterans, this shift validated some of their wartime assessments. Americans had proven themselves as capable warriors whose power now shielded Western Europe, but it also required acknowledging that they had been catastrophically wrong about larger strategic and moral questions. By the early 21st century, as the last generation with personal memory of World War II passed away, German perspectives on American soldiers had been filtered through layers of commemoration, Cold War politics, reunification struggles, and changing historical understanding. What remained constant across these interpretations was acknowledgement that Nazi propaganda's characterization of Americans as militarily inferior had been decisively disproven. German soldiers had learned, at terrible cost, that American forces combined industrial capacity with genuine military competence, creating a combination that proved unbeatable once fully mobilized. This lesson, taught through years of combat across Europe, represented one of the Second World War's clearest verdicts. Democracies, properly aroused to action, could outfight and outlast totalitarian regimes that had dismissed them as decadent and weak. The final assessment, reached by German military historians analyzing their nation's defeat, concluded that American forces represented something Wehrmacht doctrine had never adequately prepared for, a military that was simultaneously citizen-based.